Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 386 of the podcast. It is September 29th, 2020. Joining me today is Steve Spear. He had reached out. He wanted to share some recollections of one of his most influential teachers and mentors, Hajime Oba, often known as Mr. Oba in lean circles. He passed away earlier this month at age 75. Now, I never had the chance to learn directly from Mr. Oba. I wasn't able to meet him, unfortunately, but he is really legendary in lean circles. And I know many people who were deeply influenced very directly by Mr. Oba. I hope to interview more of them in the near future. I do want to express my deepest condolences to Mr. Oba's family, friends, and colleagues. Now, if you go to the blog post for this episode at leanblog.org/386, I've linked to a classic Wall Street Journal article from 2001 that features Mr. Oba. It's called "How Does Toyota Maintain Quality? Mr. Oba's Hairdryer Offers a Clue." So in today's episode, Steve talks about meeting Mr. Oba and how he learned from him as a PhD student. There's one story that Steve shares about sitting at his desk. He was thinking about a problem, and Mr. Oba told him, "Don't think, do." So you'll hear about that, and you'll hear more from Steve talking about the need to learn by doing and to test changes in experimental fashion. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. And again, you can find a link to it at leanblog.org/386. We're joined again, a returning guest, Steve Spear. Among other things, he is, and you can fill in any other details if I miss Steve, but he's a principal at his company, HVE LLC. He's the author, of course, of the outstanding book, The High Velocity Edge. He's the founder and co-creator of software called C2Solve, and he's a senior lecturer at MIT. So, Steve, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me back.
And as you know, we've talked about before in various podcasts, you had the opportunity, of course, to learn very directly from Toyota through your studies and through your PhD work, which brings us to our topic today, reflections on the legendary Mr. Oba from Toyota. Really just give you the floor to share some memories and thoughts and recollections.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. So just as background for those who didn't know Mr. Oba, he was the first head of Toyota's Supplier Support Center. And that was created here in North America for the very simple reason that as Toyota tried to globally localize, make each of their markets more and more self-reliant, they became increasingly dependent on the North American auto supply network, which had very, very little familiarity with Toyota's approach around quality, just-in-time, pulse systems, employee engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And so while Toyota was doing a ton of work on the really historic transformation at the NUMMI plant, which had been a General Motors facility, and the stand-up in Kentucky and then elsewhere, there was this need to help suppliers come to understand the basic thinking of Toyota. And so Mr. Oba's organization, this TSSC, became the one of the sources for that much deeper understanding. Now, I think this reflects in part Toyota's values, in part Mr. Oba, but not only did Mr. Oba work with suppliers directly, he also took on as unpaying clients companies that did manufacturing, but did manufacturing outside that of the auto industry. And in reflecting about Mr. Oba, and this sort of is to build up that his life was value-driven as much as it was manufacturing or business-driven, is that in part, I think he took on these other clients to expand the experience set of his and his colleagues, seeing products and processes and markets that they hadn't seen before. And you could say, well, that's sort of a self-centered, selfish motivation. But part of it is I think Mr. Oba felt that he had something really profound to share with North American manufacturers. And if he had bandwidth to engage with people who had nothing to do with the auto industry, and then perhaps, maybe they had products and processes which really weren't that much more interesting than what was going on in autos anyway, it still was a way to spread the effect of the Toyota production system, which fundamentally is a way to tap deeply into the innate problem-solving potential of people so they can better meet society's needs. And I think Mr. Oba saw this as an opportunity to expand the impact of that managerial mindset and that managerial system to have broader effect. The reason I feel so convinced that a lot of what he did was for altruistic purposes is that TSSC over the years evolved from dealing with Toyota suppliers, because that was the pressing concern, to unaffiliated manufacturers, to organizations which just have social purpose, healthcare, feeding the homeless, putting up, or feeding the hungry, putting up homes for the homeless, and so on and so forth. Right. And one last thing I'll just offer is when I was in contact with Mr. Oba's family, they said that he had a very long and really passionate concern about the quality of drinking water in Africa. And they said if people really wanted to do something in honor of his memory, contributions in that direction would be very much appreciated and highly appropriate. And so anyway, I think there's a lot of dots we can connect that support the assertion that much of his life's work wasn't just about the business of cars and Toyota, but was really to take this really deep, profound thinking about how to make it far easier for people to collaborate towards common purpose and do that so much better, that was really what was motivating him, that tapping into human potential. So anyway, I just want to offer that as sort of some color commentary background on Mr. Oba.
Sure. Yeah, and he passed away on September 4th. I never had the good fortune, the opportunity to meet him. I've met and worked with a number of people who did work, had the opportunity to learn from him. You mentioned TSSC, right. Worked with Herman Miller, so I know some people from the Herman Miller lineage who had direct exposure to him. So I know his passing has touched very directly a great number of people in the lean community. And I'll make sure I'll link to his obituary and different articles about his passing in the show notes. Yeah,
another guy who I know a long time, since about 95, 96, is Bruce Hamilton, now head of the Greater Boston Manufacturing Partnership, referred affectionately within the lean community as the old lean dude. He's done this really great video on toast Kaizen and such.
Right.
To his credit, Bruce was way ahead of the wave. He was doing lean before it was even called that. He was when he was in his executive role at United Electric in Watertown, Massachusetts. He had created this library and this training system, pulling in anything he could get from Norman Bodek and all the others who were doing that very, very early work to understand what was going on in Japan. And Bruce was another one of these. I would characterize it in terms of relationships. Not to diminish it, but sort of in a Karate Kid analogy, maybe I was one of many Daniels to Mr. Oba's Mr. Miyagi. Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is because his way of teaching was very much a wax on, wax off, paint up, paint down, inductive, immersive approach to learning what he was trying to teach. And certainly Bruce is another one of those Daniels. And there are many others who feel very appreciative of the opportunity to learn from Mr. Oba and quite in his debt, because that experience was so mind-changing and so action-changing and life-changing as a consequence.
Yeah. And about our friend Bruce, that's a name he's bestowed upon himself, old lean dude. So all right. A self-deprecating, OLD becomes an acronym within old. So
right. Yeah. So
I'm glad you called Bruce. I didn't suspect that he was the bully from Cobra Kai. I figured Bruce was another Daniel, not the bully figure.
No, definitely not the bully. So Bruce's relation with United Electric is one of those companies where I think Mr. Oba got interested because of Bruce and the people around Bruce who were really, really convinced that they needed a different way and committed to learning by doing to discover and understand what that different way was. The work they were doing, it doesn't strike me as that was by product or process or market even a real source of insight for Mr. Oba, but it was a chance to expand his the population of his active, engaged, enthusiastic students. And Bruce certainly has been one for 30 years and counting.
Yeah, and I'll reach out to Bruce. Maybe I can also do an interview with him. And
Yep.
some of his reflections. So, when you talk about that teaching style, did you have direct contact with Mr. Oba during your PhD studies? And you
Yeah. So to this day, I've had some very important mentors in my life, and I would count Mr. Oba as one. Kent Bowen, who was my chief advisor when I was doing my dissertation. Clay Christensen, certainly. I mean, a lot of people were willing to make a huge investment in me that the only way I could possibly reciprocate is take what they taught me and try to reflect it forward, because I can never pay them back.
Sure.
And I still don't know if it was a deliberate setup. Kent and I had gone out west to visit a factory for a company. And ostensibly it was because it was an interesting company with a long history and an interesting product. It turned out also on that visit was Mr. Oba. And in hindsight, Mr. Oba was far more interesting than the factory and the company. And I just don't know, and Kent won't tell me, whether the trip was really to visit that factory and that company, or was the setup to see if I would grab the hook and be curious enough about Mr. Oba to do anything with it. Anyway, I did grab the hook. But here's the first sort of anecdote and sort of insight about Mr. Oba and this Toyota production system, management system, when it's practiced at very, very high fidelity. So we're inside this factory, and they're making a very, very sophisticated electronic product, and they're using very, very sophisticated industrial machinery to do that. And the normal way to take such a tour of a facility like that, and the way in which the tour was actually organized, was you start in receiving and work your way step by step by step through shipping. And the reason you do that is you get to see sort of nondescript raw materials take magnificent form through the interaction with these marvelous pieces of technology. And so we started the tour, and we saw this bell, and we saw that whistle, and we saw this chrome-plated gizmo. And after about 15, 20 minutes, Mr. Oba interrupted in a polite way, but in a very certain way, that he was kind of tired of seeing things that way. He wanted to go to shipping. And we got to shipping, and of all the things in the factory, he started paying a tremendous amount of attention to the person who was actually loading boxes onto trucks. And after he did that, to understand what they were shipping, where they were shipping, what their expectations were in terms of shipping, how they were actually doing, how they learned about what to ship and all of that, Mr. Oba's next question then was, and the stuff you ship, who gives it to you? And I just want to point out that the phrase, it didn't hit me at the time, it's only in hindsight. It wasn't from where did it come, it was from whom did it come? And it came from Alice. So we went back and met Alice, and then a similar thing about, what work does Alice do? On behalf of whom does she do her work? From whom does she get the things she needs for her work, both material and information? And we did this steady progressive walk back through the factory. Now, a couple of things that hit me at first. I mean, the first thing was Mr. Oba, after we were done with this sort of backwards tour from shipping through the preceding steps, we went into a conference room, and on a whiteboard, he did a schematic representation of the facility in terms of the flow of work, flow of material, flow of information, but then identifying where they would have problems of scrap, of defects, of delays, of starving, of blocking, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that was clearly impressive to his hosts was that even though he hadn't seen those problems occur, it had a huge amount of face validity, because that's when they started taking out notepads and pens, trying to record and trying to guess how he could predict with such accuracy where they were having problems. And just as an aside, I saw Mr. Oba do sort of the same magic the following day and the day after. And my first interpretation of that was, well, here's a guy with already at that point, 20, 30 years of experience at Toyota. He's probably seen best in class in so many different industries. And he was comparing this in a sort of in an analogy fashion to what he had seen as best practice. And he was showing them how they were not best practice. And that thought balloon got popped soon thereafter when we started going to a place, and Mr. Oba was clearly excited. And I asked why, and he said because he'd never seen that type of product made with those types of processes. It would be a novel situation even for him. And yet, using the same approach, it took him not more than 15, 20 minutes to understand enough to generate the schematic and identify all the pain points. And it was out of that I realized that Mr. Oba really was the interesting thing on this trip, because he had a way of looking at systems, very complex ones, from a first principles basis, rather than from an analogy case-by-case basis. And a lot of what I wrote in that first article, Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System, and the rules by how you design a process, and then I translated that a little bit and updated it. It's like, I think, chapter 6 in my book. I could have really called that Decoding Mr. Oba's DNA, not Toyota. Well, anyway, be that as it may. But the real point, that's what sort of sunk in most immediately. But the thing that really grabbed me over the years, and the reason I want to share this with you and your audience, is you start thinking about that act of going to shipping, and in shipping, finding the shipping clerk, who in most situations has got probably the least glamorous job in any organization, right? Putting brown boxes on brown trucks. And yet Mr. Oba was really genuinely interested in the experience of that person, and genuinely interested in the experience of that person because that person, their ability to perform their job affected how the customer experienced the efforts of this collective called a factory. And from there, Mr. Oba's next concern was, if this person is, and their ability to perform their work is representative of how the factory is behaving, then everything flowing into that person is the next most important thing in this entire system. And that's why Mr. Oba said to the person in shipping, from whom did you get the things you need? Oh, Alice. And what became real evident is that the way he thought of systems, despite the sophistication of the product and the sophistication of the process, the technical sophistication, it was really about people doing things so that they could create value that someone else would appreciate. And that has really, once I got it, I have to admit it didn't come immediately, but once I got it, it was such a compelling message about how we think about organizations, how we think about systems, how we think about offices, factories, hospitals, et cetera, is that if we're in a position to influence their design, if we're in a position to influence their behavior, their dynamics, we always have to think in terms of, are we increasing or decreasing the ability of each individual to do something that will be valued by somebody else? And, you talk about, and I'll stop with this, but, we think about all the different ways in which we get, what do they call the KPIs and other metrics of performance. And Mr. Oba, in that simple act of going to shipping and saying, who is dependent on you and on whom are you dependent? He took all those KPIs and narrowed it down to a single focal, which was what you're doing, does it count? And if we can change the system so what you're doing counts more, we're going in the right direction. And if what we're doing takes what you're doing and makes it count less, we're going in the wrong direction. And all those KPIs, all it narrowed down to, are we making your efforts more valued by somebody else? Boom, that was it. So anyway, I wanted to be sure to share that with you all.
Yeah, so I'm curious, the way you were telling the story of looking back upstream and asking who, was he looking for a person's name like Alice? Or a lot of times people would say, well, final inspection sends that to me. Was he really focusing on names and individuals over
Mark,
departments?
that is such a good question. Mr. Oba wanted a name. And I'll tell you why he wanted a name. So let me set up this contrast. And that's a great lead-in question. So we often do this exercise when I teach, when I train. It's you have to build a little factory to make paper airplanes. And one of the failure modes is that people don't ask the customer who's standing at the side of the exercise, at the side of the simulation. And we all laugh about it, blah, blah, blah. And they say, all right, well, let's think about this. The work you do, when you're done and you bundle it up and you hand it off, who do you hand it off to? And at best, they can name a department or a function. They can never name a person. And it's like, all right, well, what does that function expect from you? And they have no answer. And similarly, when you ask them on whom are you dependent, they can't come up with a name. And then you say, well, have you ever had the conversation with that person about what you need from him or her to do your work effectively? And more often than not, and look, your listeners can do the test drive on this. On whom do you really depend, and on who depends on you, and do you have a shared understanding? All right, so here's where that plays out. Is that most people don't have a good answer to that. But do you think about why we work in organizations and not just sort of individual contractors? Is because there's something about the collaboration that creates the magic of the finished product or the finished service. We can't do it on our own. We can't be independent contractors. And the collaboration implies dependencies. And dependencies mean that there are relationships inside an organization that, we have two-way expectations in terms of what our relationship will be, so that together we're more productive than we could possibly have imagined individually. And I think what Mr. Oba was doing was by asking from whom. It was a quick pop quiz to see if people really understood the relationships, the network of relationships in which they were embedded to more fully express their potential. Yeah. And I'll give you just one more observation on that sort of supports that assertion that Oba and his really thoughtful colleagues thought about relationships between people. So I remember asking the justification for pull systems versus push, for just in time versus scheduled. And you'd get the very rational answer about how push is a very fragile system because it's a schedule being confronted by reality, and reality always gets a veto, blah, blah, blah. And you get a very rational explanation that just in time, and this is a great separate conversation, creates a dynamically self-regulating system, which is all true. Mm-hmm. But I remember when I was talking to the Toyota people and asked them why they did what they did, there'd always be the rational explanation. But then there'd be the emotional one. And so when you asked about just in time and they talked about this whole self-synchronization thing, they say, look, in order to build a car, at the start, someone is in time and distance so physically removed from the person who buys the car. But here's the thing. If we set up our system such that if someone wants a car, it triggers the generation of the car or the replacement of the thing that's been taken. Someone could be working way, way upstream, generating spark plugs or some tiny component. And every time they're asked for another box of that little thing, they can say to themselves, isn't that great? I'm being asked for this other box of stuff because the last box delighted someone enough that they bought it and someone wants some more. So anyway, tying that back to this Mr. Oba starting and shipping, it was very important to him, and it is very important to the folks who really, really understand this really profound management system, that the work you do, you understand it's appreciated. And it's not appreciated by a machine. It's not appreciated by a box. It's not appreciated by a building. It's appreciated by an individual. And what he was demonstrating, even in that first interaction, was that you have to be really clear as to what the relationships are so you can see where the appreciation comes from and to whom appreciation is owed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't help but think of, flows through a hospital. You could do a similar exercise. You could ask the physician who's looking at a test result, from whom did that clinical lab result come from?
Yep.
And the person in the lab could be asked, from whom did that specimen come from? Do they have a name, or do they just say phlebotomy?
Right.
ER. And I've seen a lot of cases where people literally don't know the people in those functions. That's where the finger pointing comes into play. It's easier to blame those anonymous jerks in some other department. And when you know people, and when I've had an opportunity to do those process walks with people in hospitals, and they start to meet each other and learn their names and understand the process. So when you talk about the rational and the emotional, I can see those connections. It's not just understanding what happens, but it's the relationships amongst those people.
And Mark, look, it's a beautiful thing, because once you start talking in terms of relationship, it changes the nature of how people view their work, from being just a technical pursuit or a functional pursuit to something that someone else will appreciate. So you see it in labs, where you say to someone, well, what are you doing here? And you could have a technician working in a lab, and they're preparing a slide and putting stain on a sample, and they'll explain technically what they're doing. And it's important they have pride in that work, but it's a little discouraging because they don't understand that work in terms of the value creating experience. Right. Now we've been in, unfortunately too rare, but we've been in some facilities where you ask that technician what he or she is doing, and she says, I'm making the doctor smarter. That doctor has a patient, and I can actually see their name on the label. And the reason that doctor ordered a test is because they don't know. That doctor doesn't know really the condition of the patient. And the work I'm doing now is to make the doctor smarter about the patient, so the doctor can be better at making that patient well off. Yeah. And this even occurred. Rick Shannon, who I first met in Pittsburgh and has since gone on from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia to Virginia, then to Duke now. Right. I remember when he was starting to really buy into this whole mindset, absorbed somewhat from Toyota, somewhat from Alcoa, he realized he had to start explaining prevention of infection to everybody, not just that doctor here and a nurse there and so on. And they started explaining infection prevention because they were worried about ventilator-associated pneumonia, surgical site infection, central line infections, and so on. And one day he walked into a room where they did various procedures, and it looked way better organized. And he asked around who had done the organization, and it turned out it was the housekeeping staff. And the reason they had done it, for the first time, someone had explained sort of germ theory to them, and they saw all the stuff that was on a rack and fell on the floor and got put back on the rack. And the guy who technically, functionally, when you said, well, what does that person do? Oh, they mop a floor, they empty waste paper baskets. Now this person is realizing and came out and said, I didn't realize it till someone told me, but my job is to keep the patient safe. That's why I do what I do. And I saw all these chains of transmission that I had the insight and the power and the creativity to break. I think that story from Rick is a really good reflection of Mr. Oba's idea that you're creating this network of relationships. And within each relationship and the network as a whole, the point is to do something that someone else will perceive as valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think through the different ways that work could be described. If I slice this specimen that's encased in paraffin and I put it on a slide versus I'm helping a physician, or I'm helping detect cancer, or I'm helping rule out cancer based on what is seen through that. I always appreciate organizations that have this mindset of everybody a caregiver, regardless of their role or function. And you see that very strong in organizations where somebody would say, well, what do you do? Is your job to mop the floor, or are you part of the infection control team? Or are you part of the patient care team? One thing, sometimes hospitals want to replace lower level jobs with robots, automated carts that drag material throughout the hospital. But the one argument, even if there's a rational case for having a robot do that work, a robot can't stop and smile at a family member who's walking through the hospital. A robot isn't going to stop and give directions if someone looks confused.
Yeah, we saw something similar to that. I'm glad it's a story I hadn't remembered in a long time, so I appreciate the reminder. It was working with specialty, nutrition and dietary functions. I think in Mass General over here, and it was kind of a Rick Shannon approach, which was you can think about the people who prepare meals. It's in a remote part of the hospital, deliver meals. They're just schlepping food, right? But when the more senior leadership started explaining to people nutrition and diet and how it influenced the well-being of the patient, the dietary aides, these are the young men and women who carry trays into rooms. All of a sudden they started recognizing foods that got eaten, foods that didn't get eaten, foods that got thrown away, foods that patient families were buying on the side to supplement, complement, replace what had been ordered. And they became part of the treatment team. And I appreciate you use that word, right? Because it's one thing for a senior leader to say, we're all caregivers. All right, it's one thing to say it, but you actually have to do the hard work to explain to everybody how their piece of work contributes to the care to make that so. It's more than just a phrase.
Yeah, and I think, kind of just from a very personal perspective, my grandfather passed away a couple of years ago, and he was 93. And during some of his hospitalizations, the biggest risk to him were errors coming from dietary services. He had trouble swallowing. And there are these products, called thickeners that are literally, put into water to make water more viscous and easier for him to swallow. That would get forgotten. And he had diabetes, and sometimes the food orders didn't properly reflect that. So, family members are there sort of playing defense, say, no, that's wrong. No, that's inappropriate. So it's easy to think of it as just food, but there's real clinical purpose there or risk.
Yeah, it's a funny story because it has no negative clinical consequence. But I do remember someone being hospitalized, and they had an allergic reaction to eggs. And it was the third day in a row that their breakfast included eggs. like, what are you all trying to kill me here? So, but anyway, back to Mr. Oba. That was a key thing. That a key theme of his work was that the work need be purposeful in creating perceived value, and that the person doing the work understand the appreciation that their effort warranted. You weren't just tightening a nut or a bolt. You were making a car safe for somebody, and you should understand that they knew that and they thanked you for it.
Yeah. So you talk about purpose, and one other thing I want to talk to you about or ask you about. A couple of weeks ago, Toyota had put out an article through their own releases, came from Japan, in English, talking about Akio Toyoda as CEO, who no doubt was influenced by Mr. Oba and others in the lineage of thinkers there, the leaders of a lot of those efforts. So one thing that was interesting is that Akio Toyoda is teaching classes internally to Toyota about the Toyota production system, and that he was teaching managers and people at different levels. And part of it would be tempting, or part of my reaction was to look at it and say, well, why aren't they having to teach that in the classroom? I thought they're living that every day. But then the one thing Mr. Toyota emphasized in terms of purpose for improvement work was this very, very strong prioritization on making work easier, which is a different way of framing
Right.
quality or efficiency or other things we might look at, might have measures, back to your questions about KPIs. So there's maybe both rational and emotional justifications for that emphasis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great recollection. And I think what Mr. Toyota was doing was not surprisingly consistent with Mr. Oba's point of view, which was the reason you're coming to work is to do something valuable for somebody else. And if we want to measure our success in terms of Kaizen, we can simply ask, was it easier for you to create value or not? And if it was, fantastic, we moved in the right direction. And if it wasn't easier for you to create value for somebody else, then we may not have moved in the right direction. And again, it really sort of makes far less complicated this whole idea of generating, recording, calculating, reporting KPIs. It's just like, hey, Mark, was that easier? And to the person who depends on you, was that better? It's two questions. Yes and yes. Good. Today was a good day. Yeah, no and no, that today was a bad day. And no and yes, then tomorrow we got to improve upon that.
Sometimes it's a judgment call or a feeling. And I know some people would cringe and say, well, what do you mean? It has to be measurable. I'm like, well,
that's a measurement, right? You're happy or sad. That's a measurement.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can spend too much time trying to quantify the measurement of something.
Yeah.
And if we can't get to the quantification, we said, well, we make the mistake of saying we can't measure it quantitatively, and then we jump to it's not worth measuring.
Point. Yeah.
And there's a lot of important things we miss when we jump from it's hard to measure to it's not worth measuring.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And you talk about meaning and purpose, and I've got this. This is a proof copy, Steve. We're going to send you a copy of this book that we put together of some of Mr. O'Neill's speeches.
Yep.
And, I'm just recalling, of his 3 questions, we've talked about this before, that everybody in the workplace should be able to say yes without reservation to, am I given the tools, training, resources, and encouragement needed to make a contribution to the organization? That's not the end of the sentence. That adds meaning to my life. And that those last words are really powerful. It's not just about make things more efficient for the organization.
Yep. Yeah. No, Paul also was one of those rare true believers about such principles.
So one other thing I think you were going to touch on, thinking back to Mr. Oba, you've talked about how he looked at processes. You also had some thoughts about how he looked at learning, I think.
Yeah.
So
again, back to the Mr. Miyagi-Daniel thing. Mr. Oba was very into the learn by doing, but also learn while doing. And I'll share with you a couple of stories to make that point more clear. So I interned inside his organization for an extended period, literally early Monday morning flying to Kentucky, where I was part of a team trying to stand up a first-tier supplier, then coming back Thursday evening after spending 4 weeks, and you'll appreciate what this means, being really pulled through the keyhole of Mr. Oba's Karate Kid training method, only to then spend Friday getting a similar intellectual exertion with Kent Bowen, who was my advisor. So Mr. Oba, when he saw me sitting there thinking through a problem, he admonished me not to think, but to do. And it didn't make sense because here I was a graduate student, I thought my job was to think. And what I eventually appreciated with Mr. Oba is that what I was thinking about was a problem. And the reason we had a problem is because we had an understanding of a situation that was adequate only to have problems. If it was more adequate, we wouldn't have the problems to even think about. And so here Mr. Oba's attitude was that you already had experiences, and those experiences had formed a mental model. And together, those experiences plus that mental model was good enough for a problem. And so if you sat there and thought, drawing upon those same experiences, employing the same mental models, guess what? You would keep getting a problem. If you did it a second time, you get the problem again and again and again. So why was Mr. Oba so much into this don't think, do? In the act of doing, you have another experience. And maybe it changes your mental model a little bit. Or maybe in addition, you have the additional experience and a change in perspective, and it changes the mental model. And if you change the experiences on which you're drawing and the mental models you're employing, if you change those, you change the outcome. And maybe, just maybe, if you do that well enough or often enough or lucky enough, you change the outcome to go from problem to success.
Right.
And, the thing I would add to that is that, Mr. Oba was advocating this don't think, do. I met him in 1995, 96. And now the don't think, do it with different semantic labels is all the rage in literature, right? So managerial literature. So the lean startup stuff is also a don't think, do mindset, which is you got an idea, you got a potential market. Well, go test your idea, because the more you think about it, the more you're going to stuck with it's just an idea. But if you test it out and get feedback, eventually you can iterate and evolve towards something successful.
Right.
The folks in the agile community in the IT world, it's a similar don't think, do mindset, right? Which is you've got a program, you have to develop a product way downstream. You can think about it all you want, but you don't have the right answer. You're never going to get the right answer because you don't have it now. And until you start generating more experience and more perspective, you can't get to the right answer. So a lot of their nomenclature, minimally viable product. Why? Because that's the smallest thing you can do. It's the minimal, not the maximal, right? Right. Why do you have a sprint? Because you want to do as quickly as possible. Why do you have a scrum or whatever they call those reviews? Is because now that you've sprinted to the minimal thing, the minimal doing, you want to reflect on what you've learned from the sprint and from the minimally viable product, so you can plan out the next minimal and the next sprint to it. So anyway, it turns out don't think, do, and again, with discipline, with thoughtfulness, with open-mindedness, all those qualifiers, don't think, do is the way you discover.
Right.
If all you do is think, you're trapped into the space you already experienced and you already know.
Right.
And so anyway, I think you piece these two things together, which is Mr. Oba's sense of value, and Paul O'Neill's, I think you very correctly interlaced, which is, you should have, it's fair to expect that the work you do, you understand how it improves someone else's lot in life, and your lot in life is also improved by doing the work. And that if in any way you're disappointed by the experience, or your experience is disappointing somebody else, it's improvable. It's not written or locked in that disappointment is inevitable. It's just that that's what you're capable of now. And so if you want to be capable of not disappointing, but actually delighting someone else and being delighted by your own experience, the way to do that is stop thinking and just do. And of course, it's a loaded do, which is don't think, do, but in such a way that you're going to get very fast feedback to learn and improve and get better.
Well, and that's where it's just repeat back, and then I know you need to go. The word test, I think, is really important, right? There's a difference between doing and testing. Testing implies some feedback loop and confirmation.
Right.
And the final thing I'll share, I learned this from Pascal Dennis, who is a Toyota person in Ontario. One thing that Pascal really helped me understand was the idea of, we don't know the root cause because we talked about it in front of a whiteboard.
Right.
We have a hypothesis, and then go and test countermeasures, which may prove or disprove that you're somewhere near the root cause.
Bingo.
And that's a totally different mindset, and I'm really grateful to learn that.
Yeah, if it's on a whiteboard, it's a guess. And until you go out and test the guess in practice and find out what's wrong with your guess, you don't get any smarter. I mean, you have a pretty whiteboard, but you don't have an answer.
Hypothesis sounds so much smarter than guess.
I'm drawing down on Richard Feynman, who said, what do scientists do? He said they guess. And then they go out and they run experiments to find out what's wrong with the guess. Yeah. So there you have it.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you for sharing, not only some personal reflections, but some really important lessons that come from Mr. Oba. So it's always a pleasure to hear from you and to talk with you. So thank you for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome for that. And Mark, thanks for the opportunity, because, I imagine it came through at least a little bit. Mr. Oba was profoundly important in the trajectory that my life has taken since we met on the West Coast in 1996. And I am completely and continuously grateful for that impact. So to have this opportunity to reflect, that just, personally is a nice opportunity, and to share maybe some pay it forward in a way, to share with your listeners some of the lessons I learned from him and how I learned them. That's certainly a nice tribute. So thanks for that opportunity.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.